One or two impressions, however, stand out from those first discourses. Christianity had once meant to me the realization of God as the Father, but I had long mourned over my own loss of faith in this symbolism and had desired to study its value as an idea, apart from its objective truth or untruth. For I suspected that such a conception would have its own effect on the character and perhaps on the civilization of those who held it. This question, however, I had been unable to follow up for want of material of comparison. And here was one who told us of no less than 5 systems of worship, founded on similar personifications of the divine idea. He preached a religion which began with the classification of religious ideas. I was very much struck, further, by the strangeness as well as the dignity of some of the Indian conceptions which I now heard of for the first time. The very newness of these metaphors and of the turn of thought made them an acquisition. There was the tale, for instance, of the saint who ran after a thief with the vessels he had dropped in his terror at being discovered, and cast them all at his feet, crying, "O Lord, I knew not that thou was there. Take them, they are thine. Pardon me, thy child." And again, of the same saint, we heard how he described the bite of a cobra, when at nightfall he recovered, by saying, "A messenger came to me from the beloved." There was the inference, again, that the Swami himself had drawn from the mirage in the desert. 15 days he had seen it and taken it always to be water. But now that he had been thirsty and found it to be unreal, he might see it again for 15 days. But always henceforth he would know it to be false. The experience to which such achievements had been possible, the philosophy that could draw some parallel between this journey in the desert and life, were such as it seemed an education to understand. But there was a third element in the Swami's teaching, whose unexpectedness occasioned me some surprise. It was easy to see that he was no mere lecturer, like some other propounders of advanced ideas whom I had heard even from the pulpit. It was by no means his intention to set forth dainty dishes of poetry and intellectuality for the enjoyment of the rich and idle classes. He was, to his own thinking at least, as clearly an apostle, making an appeal to men, as any poor evangelical preacher or Salvation Army officer, calling on the world to enter into the kingdom of God. And yet he took his stand on what was noblest and best in us. I was not thinking of his announcement that sin was only an evil dream. I knew that such a theory might merely be part of a cumbrous system of theology, and no more a reality to its elucidator than the doctrine that when a man steals our coat, we should give him our cloak also, was to ourselves. The thing that I found astonishing was a certain illustration urged by him. His audience was composed for the most part of fashionable young mothers, and he spoke of their terror and their flight. If a tiger should suddenly appear before them in the street. But suppose, he said, with a sudden change of tone, suppose there were a baby in the path of the tiger. Where would your place be then? At his mouth? Any of you, I am sure of it. These, then, were the things I remembered and pondered over concerning the Swami when he had left England that winter for America. First, the breadth of his religious culture. Second, the great intellectual newness and interest of the thought he had brought to us. And thirdly, the fact that his call was sounded in the name of that which was strongest and finest, and was not in any way dependent on the meaner elements in man. The Swami returned to London in April of the year following, and taught continuously at the house where he was living with his good friend Mr. E.T. Sturdy in S. George's Road, and again after the summer holidays in a large classroom near Victoria Street. During July, August, and September, he traveled in France, Germany, and Switzerland with his friends, Mr. and Mrs. Sevier and Miss H. F. Muller. In December, he left for India, with some of his disciples by way of Rome and arrived at Colombo in Ceylon on January the 15th, 1897. Many of the lectures which he gave during the year 1896 have since been published, and in them all the world may read his message and the interpretation by which he sought to make it clear. He had come to us as a missionary of the Hindu belief in the immanent God, and he called upon us to realize the truth of his gospel for us. Ourselves. Neither then nor at any aftertime did I ever hear him advocate to his audience any specialized form of religion. He would refer freely enough to the Indian sects, or as I would like to call them, churches, by way of illustration of what he had to say, but he never preached anything but that philosophy which, to Indian thinking, underlies all creeds. He never quoted anything but the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. And he never, in public, mentioned his own master, nor spoke in specific terms of any part of Hindu mythology. He was deeply convinced of the need for Indian thought, in order to enable the religious consciousness of the West to welcome and assimilate the discoveries of modern science, and to enable it also to survive that destruction of local mythologies, which is an inevitable result of all world consolidations. He felt that what was wanted was a formulation of faith which could hold its adherents fearless of truth. The salvation of Europe depends on a rationalistic religion, he exclaims in the course of one of his lectures, and again many times repeated, the materialist is right, there is but one, only he calls that one matter, and I call it God. In another and longer passage, he describes the growth of the religious idea and the relation of its various forms to one another. At first, he says, the goal is far off, outside nature and far beyond it, attracting us all towards it. This has to be brought near, yet without being degraded or degenerated, until when it has come closer and closer, the God of heaven becomes the God in nature, till the God in nature becomes the God who is nature, and the God who is nature becomes the God within this temple of the body, and the God dwelling in the temple of the body becomes the temple itself, becomes the soul of man. Thus it reaches the last words it can teach. He whom the sages have sought in all these places is in our own hearts. Thou art he, O man, thou art he. He always considered for his own part that his greatest intellectual achievement during this period had consisted in his lectures on Maya, and it is only by reading these carefully that an idea can be formed of the difficulty of the task he undertook in trying to render the conception in modern English. Throughout the chapters in question, we feel that we are in presence of a struggle to express an idea which is clearly apprehended in a language which is not a fit vehicle for it. The word is wrongly understood, says the Swami, to mean delusion. Originally, it meant something like magic, as Indra, through his Maya, assumed various forms. But this meaning was subsequently dropped, and the word went through many transformations. A milestone in the series of conceptions that finally determined its meaning is found in the text. Because we talk in vain, and because we are satisfied with the things of the senses, and because we are running after desires, therefore we, as it were, cover this reality with a mist. Finally, the word is seen to have assumed its ultimate meaning in the quotation from the Svetasvatara Upanishad. Know nature to be Maya, and the mind the ruler of this Maya, as the Lord himself. The Maya of the Vedanta, says the speaker, in its latest development, is a simple statement of facts, what we are, and what we see around us. But that these words are not intended as a definition will be seen by anyone who reads the whole of the lectures on Maya for himself. It is there evident that the word does not simply refer to the universe as known through the senses, but also describes the tortuous, erroneous, and self-contradictory character of that knowledge. This is a statement of fact, not a theory, says the Swami, that this world is a Tantalus's hell, that we do not know anything about this universe, yet at the same time we cannot say that we do not know. To walk in the midst of a dream, half sleeping, half waking, passing all our lives in a haze, this is the fate of every one of us. This is the fate of all sense knowledge. This is the universe. We see here, as in many other of his interpretations, that an Indian word is incapable of exact rendering into English, and that the only way of arriving at an understanding of it is to try to catch the conception which the speaker is striving to express, rather than to fasten the attention on a sentence or two here or there. By Maya is thus meant that shimmering, elusive, half-real, half-unreal complexity in which there is no rest, no satisfaction, no ultimate certainty, of which we become aware through the senses and through the mind as dependent on the senses. At the same time, and that by which all this is pervaded, know that to be the Lord himself. In these two conceptions, placed side by side, we have the whole theology of Hinduism as presented by the Swami Vivekananda in the West. All other teachings and ideas are subordinated to these two. Religion was a matter of the growth of the individual, a question always of being and becoming. But such growth must presuppose the two fundamental facts and the gradual transference of the center of gravity, as it were, out of the one into the other, out of Maya into the self. The condition of absorption in Maya was bondage in the Eastern sense. To have broken that bondage was freedom, or mukti, or even nirvana. The path for the would-be breaker of bondage must always be by seeking for renunciation, not by seeking for enjoyment. In this matter, the Swami was, as he said himself, only echoing what had been the burden of all religions. For all religions, Indian and other, have called a halt in the quest for pleasure. All have sought to turn life into a battlefield rather than a ballroom. All have striven to make man strong for death rather than for life. Where I think that the Swami perhaps differed somewhat from other teachers was in his acceptance of every kind of mastery as a form of renunciation. Towards the end of his life, I told him that renunciation was the only word I had ever heard from his lips, and yet in truth I think that conquer was much more characteristic of him, for he pointed out that it was by renunciation, that is to say, by sustained and determined effort, by absorption in hard problems through lonely hours, by choosing toil and refusing ease, that Stevenson, for instance, invented the steam engine. He pointed out that the science of medicine represented as strong a concentration of man's mind upon healing as would be required for a cure by prayer or by thought. He made us feel that all study was an austerity directed to a given end of knowledge. And above all, he preached that character, and character alone, was the power that determined the permanence of a religious wave. Resistance was to his mind the duty of the citizen, non-resistance of the monk, and this because for all the supreme achievement was strength. Forgive, he said, when you can also bring legions of angels to an easy victory. While victory was still doubtful, however, only a coward to his thinking would turn the other cheek. One reads the same lesson in his master's story of the boy who for 20 years worked to acquire the power to walk on water, "And so," said a saint, "you have given 20 years of effort to doing that for which others give the ferryman a penny." The lad might have answered that no ferryman could give his passengers what he had acquired by 20 years of patient striving. But the fact remains that to these teachers, supremely sane, the world's art of navigation had its own full value and its proper place. Years afterwards, in Paris, someone approached him with a question as to the general history of the development of Indian ideas on these subjects. Did Buddha teach that the many was real and the ego unreal, while Orthodox Hinduism regards the one as the real and the many as unreal? He was asked. "Yes," answered the Swami. And what Ramakrishna Paramahansa and I have added to this is that the many and the one are the same reality, perceived by the same mind at different times and in different attitudes. Gifted to an extraordinary degree was the living utterance of metaphysic, drawing always upon a classical literature of wonderful depth and profundity. He stood in our midst as, before all, the apostle of the inner life, the prophet of the subordination of the objective to the subjective. "Remember," he said once to a disciple, "remember, the message of India is always not the soul for nature, but nature for the soul." And this was indeed the organ note, as it were, the deep fundamental vibration that began gradually to make itself heard through all the intellectual interest of the things he discussed and the point of view he revealed. Like the sound of the flute heard far away on the banks of some river in the hour of dawn, and regarded as but one amongst many sweet songs of the world, and like the same strain when the listener has drawn nearer and nearer, and at last, with his whole mind on the music, has become himself the player. May have seemed to some who heard him long the difference between the life of the soul in Western thinking and in Eastern. And with this came the exaltation of renunciation. It was not, perhaps, that the word occurred in his teachings any oftener than it had done before. It was rather that the reality of that life, free, undimensioned, sovereign, in its mastery, was making itself directly felt. A temptation that had to be fought against was the impulse to go away and bind upon oneself intellectual shackles to be born, in order to be able to enter in its fullness upon the life of poverty and silence. An occasion came when this call was uttered with great force. Some dispute occurred in the course of a question class. "What the world wants today," said the Swami, the determination to throw a bomb, as he called it, evidently taking sudden possession of him. "What the world wants today is 20 men and women who can dare to stand in the street yonder and say that they possess nothing but God. Who will go?" He had risen to his feet by this time and stood looking round his audience as if begging some of them to join him. "Why should one fear?" And then, in tones of which even now I can hear again the thunderous conviction, "If this is true, what else could matter? If it is not true, what do our lives matter? What the world wants is character," he says, in a letter written at this time to a member of his class. "The world is in need of those whose life is one burning love, selfless. That love will make every word tell like a thunderbolt. Awake, awake, great souls! The world is burning in misery. Can you sleep?